The sun hadn't cleared the horizon yet, but the cold was already settling into the bones of the men standing in formation across the open ground near Edington. It was early May, 878, somewhere in the Wiltshire countryside, and the mist hung low over the fields in that particular way it does just before dawn. You could hear the breathing of thousands of men, see it condensing in the cold air, mixing with the fog. Shields creaked as men adjusted their grips. Leather straps groaned under the weight of wooden boards reinforced with iron bosses. Feet shifted on damp ground, trying to find purchase, trying to stay warm, trying not to think too hard about what was coming. These weren't professional soldiers. Most of them were farmers, landholders, men who owed military service because they held property in Somerset or Wiltshire or Hampshire. They'd assembled at a place called Egbert's Stone a few days earlier, responding to a summons from a king many of them hadn't seen in months. Some had thought he was dead. Now they stood shoulder to shoulder in a shield wall, about 2,500 of them, facing a Viking army of 4,000 warriors who'd spent the last 13 years conquering every other Anglo-Saxon kingdom in England. The Vikings held the high ground. They had the numbers. They had a fortified base at Chippenham, just a few miles away. And if you were standing in that Saxon line, you knew the mathematics didn't look good. But the math wasn't really the point anymore. By the spring of 878, this wasn't about winning a battle in any conventional sense. It was about whether Anglo-Saxon Christian England would continue to exist at all. East Anglia had fallen. Mercia had fallen. Northumbria had fallen. Wessex was the last kingdom standing. And if the shield wall broke today, there wouldn't be another one to form tomorrow. The Vikings would occupy Winchester the way they occupied York. English kings would stop ruling from English halls. The language would change. The religion would change. The whole trajectory of the island would shift in a direction it never came back from. King Alfred was somewhere in that shield wall. He'd spent the last 4 months as a fugitive in the Somerset marshes, building a fortress on an island in the swamps, launching guerrilla raids, trying to hold together the idea that Wessex still existed as a kingdom. 3 months earlier, he'd been celebrating Christmas at Chippenham when the Vikings attacked in the middle of the night. He'd barely escaped with his life. Now he was betting everything on one morning, on whether exhausted men holding wooden shields could stand in formation long enough to outlast an army that had beaten every force it had faced for more than a decade. This wasn't just another raid. This was the moment England either survived or ceased to exist. And to understand why thousands of men stood on that field willing to die, you have to go back to a winter night 4 months earlier, when everything fell apart. It was the night of January 6th, 878. 12th night, the end of the Christmas season. Alfred had spent the holiday at Chippenham, a royal fortress in Wessex, about 30 miles from Gloucester. It should have been safe. The Vikings were supposedly in Gloucester for the winter, in the neighbouring kingdom of Mercia, operating under a treaty they'd signed with Alfred just weeks earlier. The treaty said they'd leave Wessex alone. They'd given oaths. They'd provided hostages. And for a brief moment, it looked like Alfred might actually get a peaceful winter to reorganise his kingdom. Then, sometime after midnight, the gates of Chippenham opened from the inside. Guthrum's Vikings poured through the streets in the darkness. It's possible they had help, that someone inside the fortress enabled the attack. After Alfred retook power later that year, he stripped Wulfhere, the ealdorman of Wiltshire, of all his lands. Whether that was punishment for negligence or outright betrayal, we don't know. What we do know is that the Vikings caught the royal court completely off guard during a religious feast when defences were down and most people were asleep or drunk or both. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle recorded it simply: most of the people they killed except King Alfred. He escaped with a handful of men, fleeing into the winter night with nothing but the clothes he was wearing and whatever weapons they could grab. They headed south and west, moving through forests and across frozen marshland, trying to put distance between themselves and the Vikings before dawn revealed their trail. By the time the sun came up, Alfred's kingdom had effectively ceased to exist as a functioning state. The last Anglo-Saxon king was a fugitive running through the woods in January, and Guthrum controlled the administrative centre of Wessex. To understand what made this so catastrophic, you need to know what the Vikings had already accomplished by 878. This wasn't a raiding party looking for silver and slaves. This was the Great Heathen Army, a coalition of warriors from Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, who'd arrived in England in 865 with a completely different objective. They'd come to conquer, to occupy, to settle. And over 13 years, they'd systematically dismantled every centre of Anglo-Saxon power north of the Thames. They'd landed in East Anglia in 865 and spent the winter at Thetford, taking horses from the local king in exchange for a promise not to attack. Then they marched north. In November 866, they captured York, the capital of Northumbria. And when the Northumbrians tried to retake it the following year, the Vikings killed both rival claimants to the throne in a single battle. Northumbria never recovered. In 869, they moved back into East Anglia and killed King Edmund, who later became a saint and martyr, but at the time was just another defeated ruler. By 870, they were moving through Mercia, occupying key towns, forcing the Mercian king into submission. And then they turned their attention to Wessex. Alfred had been king since 871, taking the throne at age 22 after his brother died fighting the Danes. He'd spent 7 years in a grinding war of attrition, fighting battles, paying tribute, watching the Vikings take payment and break their oaths and come back for more. They had a pattern. They'd occupy a fortified town and wait. Alfred would assemble his forces and either fight a battle he usually lost or negotiate a treaty that bought him a few months of peace. He'd pay them to leave. They'd leave. Then they'd come back and do it again. In 876, they occupied Wareham in Dorset. Alfred blockaded them, negotiated a peace, gave them money, took hostages. They slipped away to Exeter anyway. In 877, he forced another peace at Exeter, with more oaths and more promises that they'd leave Wessex and never return. They moved to Gloucester in Mercia for the winter of 877. Alfred thought he'd finally achieved a stable peace. He spent Christmas at Chippenham, 30 miles from the Viking camp, apparently feeling secure enough to hold court there. And then came Twelfth Night. So when Alfred fled Chippenham in January Autumn-Munded 878, he wasn't just retreating from one battle. He was confronting the reality that everything he'd tried for 7 years had failed. The treaties didn't work. The payments didn't work. The Vikings didn't want money. They wanted territory. Guthrum wasn't interested in raiding. He was interested in ruling. And by occupying Chippenham, he'd put himself in position to administer Wessex the same way he administered the other conquered territories. Which brings us to the commanders, because this battle ultimately came down to 2 men making very different calculations about what was possible. Guthrum was a Danish warlord who'd lost the support of other Viking leaders by the mid-870s. Ivar the Boneless was dead. Halfdan had gone north to settle in Northumbria. Ubba had taken his forces to Devon. So Guthrum was operating essentially alone with his own warband, but that warband had proven capable of conquering kingdoms. His defining characteristic was ruthless pragmatism. He used treaties as tactical tools. He broke oaths when it served his purposes. He attacked during religious festivals when defences were down. Everything about his strategy said he understood power as something you took and held, not something you negotiated for. Alfred was 29 years old in 878, and his defining characteristic was something harder to pin down. You could call it strategic patience, or maybe just survival instinct refined by years of losing. He'd been king for 7 years and spent most of that time learning what didn't work against the Vikings. The key decision he made after Chippenham was this: he didn't surrender. A lot of Anglo-Saxon leaders had surrendered by 878. It was a reasonable choice when facing impossible odds. But Alfred went to the marshes instead. He ended up at a place called Athelney, a small island in the Somerset wetlands that was accessible only by a causeway. According to a 12th century chronicler, it was originally covered with alder trees and infested with wild animals. The marshes around it were described as impassable, a great swamp that nobody could cross except by boat. Alfred built a fortress there around Easter of 878. Archaeological evidence shows it had a semicircular stockade and ditch, probably reinforcing defences from an earlier Iron Age fort. And from that island fortress, with a small force of loyal men, he started waging a different kind of war. He couldn't fight Guthrum directly. He didn't have the numbers. The Vikings controlled Chippenham and most of the major settlements in Wessex. But Alfred had something Guthrum didn't: detailed knowledge of the local terrain and the loyalty of at least some of the ealdormen and thegns who hadn't fled or submitted. Ealdorman Aethelnoth of Somerset joined him at Athelney with soldiers, supplies, and intelligence about Viking movements. And Alfred started doing something the Vikings had done to him for years. He raided. Every day, small war bands would emerge from the marshes, hit Viking patrols, ambush supply trains, raid the estates of people who'd sided with Guthrum, and then disappear back into the swamps before the Vikings could respond. It wasn't about winning territory. It was about proving that Alfred still existed as a functioning king, that resistance was still possible, that Guthrum's control of Wessex was contested. It was psychological warfare as much as military action. Every raid said, "I'm still here. I'm still fighting." And if you're a landowner trying to decide whether to submit to the Vikings or wait for Alfred to return, that message mattered. He also used those 4 months to do something crucial. He maintained contact with his supporters across Wessex through a network of scouts and messengers, because Alfred knew that eventually he'd need to assemble the fyrd, the militia army that freemen owed based on their land holdings. And that meant the ealdormen and royal reeves and king's thegns in Somerset, Wiltshire, and Hampshire needed to know he was alive and planning something. The fact that they showed up when he called them in May tells you that Alfred never fully lost control of his kingdom, even when he was living on an island in a swamp. By early May, Alfred decided it was time. The Vikings were settled at Chippenham. They weren't expecting a major Saxon offensive because they'd already beaten the main Saxon army and driven the king into hiding. Guthrum probably assumed the war was effectively over, that it was just a matter of consolidating control and negotiating Alfred's final surrender or exile. That assumption was about to become a problem. The fyrd was the militia system that had defended Anglo-Saxon England for generations, and it ran on a simple principle: if you held land, you owed military service. The amount of land you controlled was measured in units called hides, and based on that assessment, you had to contribute men and arms to the kingdom's defence. Winchester, for example, required 2,400 men, drawn from 2,400 hides. Each shire was subdivided into smaller units called hundreds, and each hundred provided a contingent of warriors when the king called a levy. In theory, it was an efficient system. In practice, it had serious limitations against an enemy like the Vikings. The Fyrd took time to assemble the Sibyls. Messages had to reach ealdormen across dispersed territories. Those ealdormen had to gather their men, organise supplies, and march to a designated meeting point. If the Vikings moved quickly or struck during planting or harvest season, you might not get enough men together in time to matter. And once you'd called a levy and fought a battle, you couldn't immediately call another one. The farmers had to go home. The harvest had to come in. So if you lost your one chance to field battle, you were done. Alfred had one chance. He designated the meeting point at a place called Egbert Stones, somewhere east of Selwood Forest. The exact location is disputed. Some historians think it was Kingston Deverill. Others suggest Penselwood. Both are about 30 miles from Athelney, which means Alfred had to ride out of the marshes and across territory partially controlled by Vikings just to reach the assembly point. The fact that he made it tells you something about how much preparation went into this. The scouts and messengers had done their work. The routes were clear. The timing was coordinated. The summons went out in the 7th week after Easter, which puts it somewhere between May 4th and 7th, 878. And the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle recorded what happened with unusual emotion for a document that's normally pretty dry. It said that the men of Somerset, Wiltshire, and that part of Hampshire west of Southampton Water came to Egbert's Stone, and they rejoiced to see him. Think about what that means. These were men who'd spent 4 months believing their king might be dead or in exile, watching Vikings occupy their kingdom, trying to figure out whether to submit or hold out. And then Alfred appeared at Egbert's Stone with an army forming behind him, and the relief must have been overwhelming. About 2,500 warriors gathered over the course of a few days. That's not a huge army by the standards of later medieval warfare, but it was substantial for Anglo-Saxon England in 878. These were shire contingents led by their ealdormen, plus the king's thegns and their personal retainers. Some had better equipment than others. The wealthier thegns would have had mail armour, good swords, well-made shields. Most of the farmers probably showed up with spears, basic shields, maybe an axe or a knife. They'd travelled on horses, but they'd fight on foot, because that's how Anglo-Saxon warfare worked. You rode to the battlefield, then you dismounted and formed a shield wall. The shield wall was the fundamental tactical unit of early medieval warfare in England. Soldiers stood shoulder to shoulder, holding round wooden shields in front of them to create a continuous barrier. The shields were typically made from planks of ash, oak, or maple glued together and reinforced with a metal boss in the centre that protected your hand and could be used to punch at an opponent. Good shields were up to 1 metre in diameter and between 5 and 13 millimetres thick, heavy enough to stop a spear thrust, but light enough to manoeuvre for hours. Behind the shield wall, warriors would hold spears for thrusting between the shields or over the top, and they'd have swords or axes for close combat if the lines got tangled together. The Vikings used basically the same equipment: round shields, spears, axes, swords. The bearded axe was a Viking specialty, with a hooked lower edge that could catch an opponent's shield and yank it down or pull it away entirely, exposing the man behind it. But in terms of fundamental tactics, both armies were going to do the same thing: form shield walls and crash them into each other until one side broke. It was a brutal, exhausting way to fight that came down to discipline and endurance more than individual skill. Alfred's army spent the night at Egbert Stone. There would have been campfires, men checking their equipment, sharpening spears, tightening shield grips. If you had mail armor, you'd check for broken rings. If you had a helmet, you'd make sure it fit properly. Mostly, you'd try to stay warm and get some sleep and not think too hard about what the next day would bring. Alfred moved among the fires, talking to the contingents, making sure the ealdormen understood the plan, which was, in essence, simple: march to where Guthrum's army was camped and force a battle. The next morning, they broke camp and marched to a place called Ely Oak. It was an ancient meeting point, possibly near what's now Sutton Veny, about 7 miles from where Guthrum had his forces positioned. The name suggests there was literally an oak tree there, big enough and distinctive enough to serve as a landmark. The Vikings were close enough that Alfred could probably see campfires, close enough that scouts from both sides were watching each other, but not so close that Guthrum could launch a surprise attack before the Saxons were ready. They spent another night at Ely Oak. And this is where you get into the psychology of the hours before a battle, which is almost always worse than the battle itself. The waiting, the uncertainty, the knowledge that tomorrow you're going to stand in a shield wall while men try to kill you. And your survival depends on the strangers standing next to you holding their positions. Some men would have prayed Christian prayers, asking God for victory, or at least a quick death. Priests would have blessed the army, consecrated weapons, offered absolution. Others would have checked their equipment for the 10th time, making sure everything was tied down properly, making sure their water skins were full, making sure they had spare spear points if their primary weapon broke. Alfred himself faced a different kind of pressure. He'd staked everything on this gamble. If the shield wall held and the Saxons won, Wessex survived. If it broke, he'd probably die on the battlefield or spend the rest of his life in exile, and Guthrum would rule from Winchester. There was no middle ground, no retreat option, no backup plan. Everything depended on whether farmers and landholders, who hadn't fought a major battle for hours, could against professional warriors who'd conquered 3 kingdoms. The battlefield geography mattered, even though there wasn't much to work with. Edington sits on relatively open ground with gentle rises, which meant there weren't dramatic natural features to use as defensive positions. No cliffs, no rivers, no forests to anchor your flanks. Just opened terrain where 2 shield walls could form up and face each other with nowhere to hide. Guthrum held slightly higher ground, closer to Chippenham, which gave him a minor advantage in visibility and a clear retreat route to the fortress, if things went badly. For Alfred, the terrain meant his shield wall had to hold in open battle with no tricks available. You couldn't ambush a Viking army on an open field. You couldn't outflank them with cavalry, because nobody fought on horseback in Anglo-Saxon England. It was going to come down to pure infantry combat, shield wall against shield wall, and whoever maintained formation longest would win. Simples in concept, extraordinarily difficult in execution. The Saxons had one advantage that wasn't immediately obvious. They were fighting for survival in a way the Vikings weren't. Guthrum's warriors were professionals. They'd spent 13 years conquering territory, and they were good at it. But they also had a fortress at Chippenham to fall back to if the battle went poorly. They could afford to lose a field engagement and try again later. Alfred couldn't. For the Saxons, this was the last stand. If they broke and ran, there was no army behind them, no second levy, no fallback position. That kind of desperation can make men hold a line when every instinct says to run. The night before the battle, sometime around midnight or later, the campfires at Ely Oak would have started dying down. Men tried to sleep, knowing they'd need their strength. Some probably could, and just lay there staring at the stars, thinking about farms they might never see again or children who might grow up fatherless. Others slept hard, the exhausted sleep of men who'd been marching for days, and a few hours before dawn the camp started stirring. Time to put on whatever armour you had. Time to pick up your shield and spear. Time to form up in the darkness and march the last few miles to where the Vikings were waiting. Before first light on that May morning in 878, Alfred's army left Ely Oak and began moving toward Edington. You could hear them before you could see them. The sound of thousands of feet on damp ground, leather creaking, metal clinking, shields bumping against legs as men marched in column. Some contingents carried torches, creating scattered points of light in the pre-dawn darkness. If you were watching from a distance, it would have looked like a river of fire, moving slowly across the countryside, breaking apart and reforming as the column navigated rough terrain. The army reached the battlefield and began the process of deployment. This wasn't quick. You had to transform a marching column into a battle line, which meant getting the shire contingents into their designated positions, making sure everyone understood where they were supposed to stand, ensuring the shield wall formed properly with no gaps. The Fyrd didn't have the kind of drill and discipline that professional armies develop. These men had trained locally in their hundreds, but they'd never fought together as a unified force. So there was shouting, confusion, ealdormen trying to organise their sections, thengs positioning warriors who'd never stood in a proper shield wall before. As the sun started to rise, the line took shape. Warriors stood shoulder to shoulder, shields raised and overlapping slightly to create a continuous barrier. Each man held a spear in his right hand, shaft resting against his shoulder or braced along his forearm, depending on his preferred technique. The front rank carried the largest shields, up to 1 metre across, heavy enough that holding one for hours would leave your arm numb. Behind them, a second rank and possibly a third, ready to step forward if the man in front fell. The Saxon line was probably about 4 or 5 ranks deep, concentrated and compact, because they didn't have enough men to spread out. Across the open ground, maybe 200 or 300 yards away, the Viking army was forming its own shield wall. They had the numbers to extend their line, which meant they could potentially wrap around the Saxon flanks if the battle devolved into a pure pushing match. Guthrum's warriors were professionals. They'd done this before. They knew how shield wall combat worked, knew how to maintain formation under pressure, knew that the key was staying locked together while trying to break the other side apart. The two armies stood there as the sun cleared the horizon, and for a while nothing happened except shouting. Warriors on both sides, yelling insults, trying to unnerve the enemy, building up their own courage. The Vikings might have been calling the Saxons farmers and cowards. The Saxons might have been invoking God and Christianity against pagans and oath-breakers. It was part of the ritual of battle, the psychological preparation for what came next. Then the missiles started. Both sides had men with javelins and throwing spears, lighter weapons designed to be hurled rather than thrust. The first volley came arcing up into the morning sky, dark lines against the pale dawn, and then they were coming down into the shield walls. You'd hear them before you felt them. The whistle of spears cutting through air, getting louder and then the impact. Most hit shields with a solid thunk metal point biting into wood. Some got through, catching men in the throat or chest or legs. You'd hear the screams, see men falling in the front rank, gaps opening that had to be filled immediately by warriors stepping forward from the second line. The exchange went on for several minutes, both sides throwing everything they had, trying to thin the opposing shield wall before the real fighting started. Your shield would get heavier as spears stuck in it, the weight pulling your arm down. If you were lucky, the bits didn't penetrate all the way through. If you weren't, you'd have spear shafts sticking out of your shield at angles, making it harder to maneuver, harder to keep it locked with the shields on either side of you. Some men dropped shields that become too unwieldy and grabbed replacements from fallen warriors. And then the missiles stopped, because both sides had thrown what they had and the distance was closing. The armies started moving toward each other. Not running, walking. A shield wall has to advance at a pace that keeps the formation intact, which means you move deliberately, shields locked, everyone stepping together. The Vikings advanced from their higher ground. The Saxons advanced uphill to meet them. The distance shrank, 300 yards, 200, 100. You could see individual faces now, see the expressions of the men who were about to try to kill you. 50 yards, 30. The sound was building, not just the tramping of feet, but shields banging rhythmically, warriors shouting to keep cadence, building momentum. 20 yards, 10. And then the shield walls hit each other with a sound like a tree falling, wood on wood, metal scraping, the entire front rank of both armies impacting simultaneously. The collision knocked men backward, shields compressed, wood flexing under the impact. For a moment, both lines recoiled slightly, and then they locked together. This was shield wall combat. Not the dramatic sword duels you see in movies, but a grinding, shoving contest where two masses of men tried to push each other backward whilst stabbing through gaps with spears. You couldn't see much, just the shield in front of you, the shields pressed against yours on either side, glimpses of Viking faces on the other side of the barrier. The fighting technique was simple but exhausting. You'd push forward with your shield, trying to create space. Then you'd thrust your spear through a gap, aiming for throat or chest or face, anywhere that wasn't protected. Then you'd pull back and do it again. The man next to you was doing the same thing. So was the man behind you, thrusting his spear over your shoulder. Multiply that by hundreds of warriors along the line, everyone pushing and stabbing and shoving, and you get a sense of what shield wall combat felt like. Constant pressure, constant effort, no rest. The noise was overwhelming, men yelling, grunting with effort, screaming when spears found flesh, wood cracking as shields split under repeated blows, metal scraping on metal when sword edges caught on shield bosses. And underneath it all, this rhythmic thudding as the lines pushed against each other, compressed and released and compressed again. The smell would have been sweat and blood and fear, bodies packed too close together, men emptying their bowels when spears punched through their guts. You couldn't see the whole battle from inside the shield wall. Your perspective was limited to maybe 3 feet in any direction. You knew what was happening in your immediate section, whether the line was holding or bending, whether the man next to you was still standing or had fallen and been replaced. But you had no idea how the flanks were doing, whether the Vikings were wrapping around the ends of the Saxon line, whether Alfred was still alive somewhere in the formation. You just fought the man in front of you and tried to stay on your feet. The casualties mounted quickly. A spear would find a gap in the shields and catch someone in the throat. He'd fall backward, blood spraying across the men behind him, and a warrior from the second rank would step forward to take his place. If you were in the front rank and you fell, you got trampled by your own side or the enemy side or both, crushed under the weight of hundreds of men pushing forward. The bodies started piling up between the shield walls, making the ground uneven, making it harder to maintain your footing. An hour passed. Then another. This was the reality of shield wall combat that doesn't make it into the dramatic retellings. It wasn't a quick, decisive clash. It was endurance warfare. Two masses of men locked together, pushing and stabbing and dying, with neither side able to break through. Your arms would be burning from holding the shield. Your shoulders would be cramping from the constant pushing. Your throat would be raw from breathing hard through your mouth because there wasn't enough air and the space was too confined and you couldn't get a full breath without lowering your shield. The Vikings had an advantage in numbers, which meant they could rotate fresh warriors to the front more easily. When a man in the Viking shield wall got too exhausted to keep fighting effectively, someone from the rear ranks could take his place. The Saxons didn't have that luxury. They had fewer men holding the same length of line, which meant everyone was fighting longer with fewer breaks. But they also had something the Vikings didn't. They were fighting for survival in the most literal sense. If they ran, Wessex ended. If they held, it might survive. The battle settled into a pattern. Push, stab, push, stab. The line would surge forward a few feet, then get pushed back. Individual warriors would find themselves locked in personal contests with whoever was across from them in the Viking line, trading spear thrusts, trying to hook shields aside with axe blades, looking for any opening. Sometimes the shields would separate for a moment, pulling back a few feet, and men would drag wounded warriors out of the way or grab water from the fighters behind them, or just try to catch their breath before the lines crashed together again. By noon, the sun stood directly overhead and both armies were exhausted. This was the critical point. Shield wall battles often came down to who broke first from fatigue rather than who inflicted more casualties. The Vikings were still pressing forward, using their numerical advantage to maintain pressure. The Saxon line was thinning. Every man who fell left a gap that had to be covered, and eventually you run out of warriors to fill the gaps. The Vikings started to extend their line, trying to wrap around the Saxon flanks. This is where the mathematics of the battlefield started to favour them. If they could get men behind the Saxon shield wall, they could attack from multiple directions, and the formation would collapse. Alfred's commanders, the ealdormen leading the Shire contingents, made a choice. They contracted the line, pulled it tighter, made it shorter, which meant giving up width but increasing depth. The Saxon shield wall became a more compact, denser formation, with more ranks pressing forward. It was a desperate move, but it worked in the short term. The Vikings couldn't easily envelope a formation that had pulled itself into a tighter mass. But it also meant the Saxons were now occupying less ground, fighting from a defensive posture, trying to hold on rather than advance. The Vikings sensed victory getting closer. They pressed harder. More warriors cycled to the front. More pressure on every section of the Saxon line. And then, hours into the battle, something shifted. It's hard to say exactly what caused it from the historical sources we have. Maybe it was accumulated fatigue finally breaking the Viking formation. Maybe it was the Saxon shield wall's deeper ranks allowing them to maintain pressure when the Vikings expected them to collapse. Maybe it was just chance, one section of the Viking line faltering at the wrong moment. But the coherent Viking shield wall started to come apart. It probably began in one location. A group of Viking warriors who'd been fighting for hours, who were exhausted and dehydrated, and had been absorbing casualties the whole time, took a step backward. And once you start stepping backward in a shield wall, it's hard to stop. The warriors around them sensed the movement, felt the pressure decrease, and they stepped back too. The Saxon warriors opposite that section felt the Viking line give way and pushed harder. That created more pressure, more Vikings stepping back. And suddenly, what had been an organized withdrawal started turning into something closer to flight. The Saxon shield wall, which had been compressed and defensive, exploded forward. Warriors who'd been standing in formation for hours found themselves suddenly advancing, the line in front of them breaking apart. They chased the opening, pushed through, and once a shield wall loses its cohesion, it's nearly impossible to reform under pressure. The Viking formation fractured into smaller groups, trying to maintain local shield walls while the larger structure fell apart around them. This is where the slaughter began. An organized shield wall is extremely difficult to break. Individual warriors or small groups are vulnerable. The Saxons drove into the gaps in the Viking line, breaking it into isolated sections, surrounding those sections, overwhelming them. Men who'd been fighting shoulder to shoulder with their companions suddenly found themselves alone, shields broken, trying to decide whether to fight or run. Most ran. According to Asser, Alfred's biographer, the Saxons pursued the fleeing Vikings with great slaughter. That phrase meant something specific in medieval warfare. It meant the organized battle had ended and the killing phase had begun. Vikings running toward Chippenham with Saxon warriors chasing them down, spearing them from behind, cutting them down with axes. No formation. No shield wall protection. Just men running for their lives across open ground, and not all of them making it. The distance from the battlefield to Chippenham wasn't far. Maybe a few miles. Close enough that some Vikings made it to the fortress gates before the Saxons caught them. But a lot didn't. The Chronicle mentioned that many were slaughtered en route, and the bodies between Edington and Chippenham probably told that story. The Vikings who did reach the fortress got inside and barred the gates. The ones who didn't became casualties. By late afternoon, Alfred's army had surrounded Chippenham. The fortress was well defended with wooden palisades and ditches. The kind of fortification the Vikings had proven very good at holding throughout their campaigns in England. Under normal circumstances, besieging a Viking position was a losing proposition. They'd already demonstrated at places like Wareham and Exeter that they could hold fortified towns and either wait out a siege or slip away when the besiegers got tired of waiting. But the circumstances at Chippenham in May 878 were different from any previous siege. For one thing, Alfred now controlled the countryside. The Vikings had lost their field army. The warriors, who made it back to Chippenham, were the survivors of a broken shield wall. Men who'd run for miles being chased by enemies, who'd just won the biggest victory of their lives. They weren't in any condition to launch raids or gather supplies from the surrounding area. For another thing, there was no relief force coming. The other Viking armies that had been operating in England were scattered. Uber was dead, killed at Sinwit in Devon by local forces earlier that same year. Hafton was in Northumbria. There was nobody in position to break the siege. So Guthrum was trapped with a remnant of his army in a fortress that couldn't sustain itself without resupply. And Alfred, for the first time in 7 years, had leverage. The siege lasted 14 days. That might not sound like much, but you have to understand what a siege meant in practical terms. Alfred's forces surrounded Chippenham and cut it off from the outside world. No supplies going in, no messengers going out. No foraging parties allowed to gather food or water from the surrounding area. Just a gradual tightening of the blockade, while the Vikings inside consumed whatever stores they had. Medieval fortresses weren't designed to hold out indefinitely. They could survive a few days or maybe a week if they had good supplies stored. But 2 weeks was pushing the limits, especially if you had a large garrison consuming food and water at a high rate. The Vikings at Chippenham had probably been living off the local countryside before the battle, taking what they needed from Saxon farms and settlements. Now, they were confined to the fortress with however much food they'd managed to store, and that number was finite. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle described their condition after 2 weeks as thoroughly terrified by hunger, cold and fear. Cold is interesting because it was May, not the middle of winter. But May nights in England can still be cold, especially if you don't have enough firewood or if you're trying to conserve resources. And fear makes sense because they were watching the situation deteriorate with no good options available. They couldn't break out. Alfred's army was too strong and too positioned to prevent an organised escape. They couldn't hold out indefinitely because the supplies wouldn't last. They couldn't wait for rescue because there was no rescue coming. So, after 14 days, they sent an emissary to Alfred asking for terms. And this is where the power dynamic had completely reversed from every previous negotiation Alfred conducted with the Vikings. Usually, the Vikings held the fortified position and Alfred was trying to dislodge them, which meant they could negotiate from strength. They'd agree to leave in exchange for payment, or they'd promise to stay in their designated territory, and Alfred would pay them off because he didn't have better options. But at Chippenham in May 878, Alfred had all the leverage. Guthrum was starving in a fortress he couldn't escape, and Alfred could afford to wait. The terms Alfred demanded were harsh by the standards of previous treaties. First, Guthrum had to provide hostages. Real people who would be held in Alfred's custody as a guarantee of Viking behaviour. Second, Guthrum and his army had to swear oaths that they would leave Wessex entirely. Not just retreat to another part of Wessex, but leave the kingdom completely. And third, Guthrum himself had to accept Christian baptism with Alfred standing as his godfather. That third requirement is worth understanding. Baptism wasn't just a religious ceremony. In the context of 9th century politics, it created a kinship bond. By becoming Guthrum's godfather, Alfred was establishing a relationship that went beyond a normal treaty. In Christian culture, the bond between godfather and godson was sacred. It meant Guthrum would be betraying not just a political agreement, but a spiritual family relationship if he broke the terms. Whether Guthrum actually believed in Christianity or was just going through the motions for political reasons, we don't know. But the ceremony mattered as a public commitment. Alfred accepted the surrender. He probably didn't have much choice. He couldn't actually destroy the entire Viking army inside Chippenham without a lengthy siege that might have given other Viking forces time to regroup or intervene. And he needed a political settlement that gave him some guarantee the Vikings wouldn't just regroup and attack again next year. So the baptism served a purpose. It transformed Guthrum from an enemy warlord into Alfred's spiritual son, someone who would be breaking the most sacred bonds in Christian society if he resumed hostilities. 3 weeks after the battle, the ceremony took place at a church in Aller, near Athelney. Guthrum came with 30 of his most important companions. The location is significant because Aller was close to the marshes where Alfred had spent 4 months as a fugitive. The same landscape that had sheltered Alfred when he was powerless now became the site of his greatest triumph. The baptism followed standard Christian ritual. Guthrum would have renounced his former gods, Odin and Thor, and the rest of the Norse pantheon, and accepted Jesus Christ as his Lord and Saviour. He was immersed in water, or had water poured over him, depending on the specific practice at that time and place. And he took a new Christian name, Athelstan. That was deliberately symbolic. Athelstan was an Anglo-Saxon name, not a Scandinavian one. It marked Guthrum's formal incorporation into Christian Anglo-Saxon culture. After the baptism, Alfred and Guthrum travelled to Wedmore, a royal estate in Somerset, where they spent 12 days feasting. This wasn't just celebration. It was a formal peace conference where the specific terms of the treaty were worked out. Those terms included the territorial boundaries between Alfred's Wessex and the Viking-controlled territories that would become known as the Danelaw. The boundary ran along the Thames River, then up the Lear River to its source, then straight to Bedford, then along the Ouse River to Watling Street, the old Roman road. Everything north and east of that line was Viking territory. Everything south and west was under Alfred's control. The treaty also established legal equivalence between Anglo-Saxons and Danes in terms of compensation for injuries. If a man was killed, whether he was English or Danish, he was valued equally at 8 half marks of pure gold. That might seem obvious, but it was actually a significant concession. It meant that the treaty recognised the Vikings as permanent residents with legal rights, not just invaders to be expelled. Guthrum kept his word. He withdrew from Wessex in the autumn of 878, moving first to Cirencester in Mercia, where he stayed for a year. Then in 879 he relocated to East Anglia, where he ruled as king until his death in 890. And as far as we can tell from the historical record, he maintained generally peaceful relations with Alfred for the rest of his life. They signed a second formal treaty in 886 that refined the boundaries and legal arrangements. There were occasional tensions and small-scale raids, but Guthrum never launched another major invasion of Wessex. The battlefield at Edington was left to the scavengers. Bodies from both sides, probably hundreds of them, scattered across the open ground where the shield walls had met. The Saxons would have buried their dead with whatever ceremony, time and resources allowed. The Viking dead probably went into mass graves or were left for carrion birds. Broken shields and splintered spears littered the field, bloodstains soaked into the dirt. Within a few weeks, grass would start growing over the evidence, and within a few years, you wouldn't be able to tell a battle had happened there, except for the occasional discovery of metal fragments when someone ploughed a field. The physical evidence of the Battle of Edington is almost non-existent today. That's not unusual for early medieval battles. Unlike later periods where armour and weapons survive in quantity, the 9th century left very little behind. Most shields were wooden and rotted away. Most weapons were valuable enough to be recovered and reused. The bodies were buried or scattered. What we know about the battle comes from written sources, primarily the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and Asser's Life of Alfred, neither of which provides detailed tactical descriptions. They record that a battle happened, that Alfred won, that the Vikings fled to Chippenham and surrendered after 2 weeks. The rest is educated inference based on what we know about shield wall combat and Viking warfare in this period. But the absence of physical evidence doesn't diminish what the battle accomplished. Alfred had gambled everything on one field engagement and won. Wessex survived. The last Anglo-Saxon kingdom remained independent. And the victory gave Alfred the breathing room he needed to fundamentally restructure how Wessex defended itself. The immediate strategic consequence of Edington was the establishment of the Danelaw, that formal division of England between Anglo-Saxon and Viking-controlled territories. It might seem like Alfred lost by accepting Viking control of more than half of England, but you have to understand the alternative. Before Edington, the Vikings were actively conquering Wessex. After Edington, they were confined to territories they already held with recognised boundaries and legal obligations. Alfred traded a military stalemate for a political settlement that gave Wessex security. And that security allowed Alfred to do something unprecedented. Over the next 20 years, he completely reorganised the military systems of Wessex in ways that made Viking raids almost impossible to sustain. The key innovation was dividing the fyrd into two rotating halves. Instead of calling up all the militia at once for a short campaign and then sending everyone home, Alfred kept half the fyrd on active duty at any given time. One group would serve for a set period while the other half stayed home farming. Then they'd swap. This gave Wessex a standing army that could respond to Viking raids immediately without waiting weeks to assemble a levy. He combined that with a network of fortified towns called burhs, strategically positioned so that no location in Wessex was more than 20 miles from a defended position. If Vikings landed and tried to raid inland, they'd hit a burh before they could penetrate far into the kingdom, and the garrison at that burh could hold out while the fyrd mobilised. The system was documented in a text called the Burgal Hiddage, which detailed how many men each burh required and which areas were responsible for providing those men. By 896, less than 20 years after Edington, the Vikings had essentially given up trying to conquer Wessex. Another Viking army arrived from the continent and tried raiding, but Alfred's reformed military system defeated them at every turn. They couldn't move freely through the countryside. They couldn't besiege fortified positions without the fyrd showing up. They couldn't win field battles against an army that was now semi-professional and battle-tested. Eventually they left, with some warriors settling in East Anglia and others returning to Scandinavia or moving to Francia, where the pickings were easier. But the long-term consequences of Edington went far beyond military reform. The victory preserved Wessex as a functioning Anglo-Saxon kingdom at a time when every other English kingdom had fallen. And that preservation created the foundation for something that hadn't existed before: a unified England. Alfred's son, Edward the Elder, ruled from 899 to 924 and spent his reign conquering the Danelaw territories. He took Mercia, pushed into the Midlands, reclaimed East Anglia. Alfred's daughter, Ethelflaed, ruled Mercia from 911 to 918 as the Lady of the Mercians, and proved just as capable a military commander as her father and brother. Together, they systematically reduced Viking control in England, building on the military system Alfred had created. Alfred's grandson, Athelstan, completed the conquest. In 927, he defeated the last Viking kingdom in Northumbria and took the title Rex Anglorum, King of the English, not King of Wessex, not King of the Anglo-Saxons, King of the English. For the first time, all of England was under unified rule. York and Winchester answered to the same king. The various Anglo-Saxon kingdoms that had spent centuries fighting each other were consolidated into a single political entity. None of that happens if the shield wall breaks at Edington. If Alfred loses that battle, Guthrum takes Wessex. The last Anglo-Saxon kingdom becomes part of the Viking territories. The language spoken in southern England shifts toward Old Norse. The religious culture shifts toward Norse paganism, or, at best, a syncretic mix of Christian and pagan practices. The whole trajectory of English development changes. You probably don't get a unified England. You might get a Scandinavian kingdom that includes parts of Britain, along with territories in Scandinavia and Ireland. The cultural and linguistic foundations that led to modern English civilization don't develop the same way. And even if you think that's overstating the case, that some form of English identity would have emerged eventually, regardless. You can't escape the fact that Alfred's victory preserved the specific form of Anglo-Saxon Christian culture that did develop. The literature, the legal traditions, the concept of English kingship that connected back through the West Saxon royal line. All of that survives because 2,500 men held a shield wall on a May morning in 878. There's something worth thinking about in that. History tends to get presented as inevitable, as if the outcomes we know happened were always going to happen that way. But they weren't. The battle could have gone differently. One section of the Saxon line could have broken an hour earlier. Alfred could have been killed by a random spear thrust. The Vikings could have maintained their formation just long enough for the Saxons to collapse from exhaustion. And if any of those things had happened, we'd be telling a completely different story about how England developed. The men standing in that shield wall at dawn didn't know they were preserving Anglo-Saxon culture or laying the foundation for a unified England. They knew they were trying to survive. They knew their king had called them to fight, and they'd answered. They knew that the Vikings in front of them were the same enemy who'd conquered every other kingdom. And if they didn't hold the line, Wessex would fall too. That was the extent of their perspective. Fight the man in front of you. Keep your shield up. Don't break formation. Stay alive. But that's what makes the battle significant. It wasn't won by people who knew they were making history. It was won by farmers and landholders who showed up because they owed military service, who stood in formation for hours in brutal, exhausting combat, and who held their ground when every instinct said to run. The victory came from collective endurance under terrible conditions, not from brilliant tactical innovations or overwhelming force. And that victory changed everything. Alfred didn't just survive, he thrived. He spent the rest of his reign as one of the most effective rulers in English history. He reformed the military, rebuilt towns, promoted education, commissioned translations of important Latin texts into Old English so more people could read them. He created a legal code that drew on earlier Anglo-Saxon law, but organized it more systematically. By the time he died in 899, Wessex wasn't just surviving, it was the dominant power in Britain. His legacy extended far beyond his lifetime. The dynasty he founded ruled England for generations. The concept of English nationhood that began to emerge in the 10th century drew directly from the preservation of Wessex and its subsequent expansion. And even after the Norman conquest in 1066, when French-speaking Normans took control of England, the underlying Anglo-Saxon legal and cultural traditions survived and evolved into what eventually became recognizable as English civilization, all of which traces back to a cold May morning in Wiltshire when a shield wall held. Centuries later, there's a monument on a quiet hill near Edington. It was built in the year 2000, more than 1,100 years after the battle. The inscription reads, "To commemorate the Battle of Edington, fought in this vicinity May 878 AD, when King Alfred the Great defeated the Viking army, giving birth to the English nationhood." Most people drive past without noticing. The fields around it look peaceful, pastoral, completely unremarkable. There's nothing to suggest that this ground once held thousands of men locked in combat, that blood soaked into this dirt, that the outcome of a day's fighting determined whether England would exist as an Anglo-Saxon Christian kingdom or become part of a Scandinavian empire, but it did. And if you stand there long enough, in the quiet, you can almost hear the echo of wooden shields colliding, the rhythm of men pushing and shouting and dying for a kingdom that most of them would never see the full extent of. They didn't fight for the idea of a unified England. That concept didn't exist yet. They fought for their king, for their land, for their survival. And in doing so, they preserved something that outlasted them by centuries. That's the Battle of Edington. Not the biggest battle of the Viking age. Not the most dramatic in conventional terms. But the battle that stopped the Vikings from taking England, that saved the last Anglo-Saxon kingdom. And that made everything that followed possible. The shield wall held, and England survived.